Tonight, we turn a corner in our series. The last 3 weeks of this series is going to be a very close look at the tenets of evolution, of what we sometimes might call the icons of evolution. What we will be looking at is some of the basic statements that evolutionary scientists make with regard to this theory, this system, which they now call fact. And we will look at those carefully and see again where the evidence leads us. So you should be on page 18 at this time. We have 2 videos to watch tonight. So I'm afraid to dim the lights on you, though. I have to read some scientific stuff from you, but I promise it will be brief. And I promise that you will be able to handle it. Because there's certain things in these books that I have not been able to handle. It hurts my brain. But most of the time they say, unless you're a molecular biologist, this is going to hurt your brain, so skip to page 19, if you want to do that, which I think is pretty cool of them. But what's very concerning to me is what you will see on page 18 of your booklets. Proponents of evolution state the following: that no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. Most of Darwin's particular theses have been fully confirmed, such as common descent, the gradualism of evolution, and his explanatory theory of natural selection. And that's Ernst Mayr, July 2000 issue of Scientific American. Eugenie C. Scott, if you don't know who she is, she's was the former president, just retired, of the National Center of Science Education. And this whole Center for Science Education came about in order to actually say evolution is what ought to be taught in schools, and we are absolutely for that, and we are against any other contradictory idea in schools, public education. So you've got a very, very large and what I would consider to be pretty powerful bunch of science educators who have an agenda on their hand. It is simply untrue that evolution is being widely challenged by scientists themselves. Help your colleagues to understand that scientists do not debate whether evolution took place, though they vigorously argue how it took place, the processes, mechanisms, and details of evolution. So what I'd have to say to that one right there is if I cannot, as a person who likes science, who wants to look at science, who wants to critically evaluate science, if I cannot look at how and argue something about how it took place with the idea that if one is not reasonable on how it took place, then why should I believe that it did take place? That's something that I believe is faulty in the statement right there. That scientists, don't ever question whether it took place. They just question how it took place. But if you cannot satisfy me on how it took place, why can't I question whether it took place? I mean, if there's a crime out there and somebody cannot satisfy me with the evidence of how it took place, I'm going to have a hard time looking at the person that they're saying did do it and saying, yes, that person did it. Next, these come out of science textbooks at the high school level. Descent with modification from common ancestors is a scientific fact. That is a hypothesis so well supported by the evidence that we take it to be true. Another one, the term theory is no longer appropriate except when referring to the various models that attempt to explain how life evolves. It is important to understand that the current questions about how life evolves in no way implies any disagreement over the fact of evolution. Those come in the textbooks. And then this one from the National Science Teachers Association, it's a voluntary association. The National Science Teachers Association, NSTA, strongly supports the position that evolution is a major unifying concept in science and should be emphasized in K-12 science education frameworks and curricula. Furthermore, if evolution is not taught, students will not achieve the level of scientific literacy needed to be well-informed citizens and prepared for college and STEM careers. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. Teachers face pressure not only to eliminate or de-emphasize the teaching of evolution, but to introduce scientific misinformation and non-science into classrooms. This pressure comes from overt advocacy of non-scientific views, such as, quote, creation science, end quote, intelligent design, end quote, or other forms of creationism, as well as the implicit advancement of those non-scientific views to teach the controversy or present strengths and weaknesses of evolution. Twisting and abusing core pedagogical principles such as critical thinking and scientific inquiry is another strategy designed to open science classroom doors to non-science. If you really look at that carefully, you will almost be thinking, I just got bullied into saying or thinking that I can no longer question evolution in a science classroom ever again. And if I do, I'm uneducated and I don't know my science, and asking a question like that or bringing up a controversy in a science classroom is something that should just not be done. Well, if evolution cannot be substantiated in the way that is usual in science by experiment and direct observation, should we not question more and more the actual processes that scientists say that they're having trouble coming to an agreement on? Should we not then say that? Because if I can't directly observe it, like many scientific things, I mean, I know that I can't explain scientifically completely gravity, but I can certainly observe it happening again and again and again. And so since macroevolution is not observable, micro certainly is, then why can't we question some of these things? Secondly, I gave you a beautiful picture there of Socrates. Do you know what he's about ready to do? He's going to drink hemlock. Do you know why he's ready to drink hemlock? Because the Greeks, as much as we would like to consider them to be very, quote, evolved people because of their democracy and everything else, found him guilty of educating youths in a subversive way by teaching them that it was very possible in his mind, just questioning whether or not gods were really sitting at the top of Mount Olympus. And since they found him guilty by a jury, they said, you will die by drinking hemlock. Or you can, if you want to get out of this, be exiled from the city and leave in the middle of the night, basically, which other people had done, and save your life. But this man was too academically honest with himself. And so he went ahead and drank the hemlock. There can be no question, Denton says, that Darwin had nothing like sufficient evidence to establish his theory of evolution. The objections were many and challenging, and Darwin, because of intellectual honesty, never tried to pretend otherwise. I think that's good of Darwin. The difficulties always weighed heavily upon him, yet despite the weakness of the evidence, Darwin's theory was elevated from what was in reality a highly speculative hypothesis into an unchallenged dogma in the space of little more than 20 years after the publication of Origin. And that, ladies and gentlemen, before we knew anything about DNA and RNA and human genomes, etc. That's quite interesting to me. How did it go from that highly speculative hypothesis to dogma or absolute fact? Well, I think a couple of things were happening in the world at that time. Denton gives his idea of that. I'll just repeat what he said. He said, number one, naturalism was becoming something that scientists were really looking to grab onto. Now, I'm not going to impugn their motives. I am just going to state that they wanted to do so. And this evolution gave them a process by which they could explain the origin of things and maybe even the origin of life by undirected natural circumstances. Secondly, the political status of the day was to say, we need to get rid of the political status of the day. You know what was happening in the mid and late 1800s and what had happened in the early 1800s. The stasis that was going on in some countries with kings and queens and monarchies was being upended. We had already gone through this Renaissance period, this period of just upending the entire Catholic Church and its stronghold on Europe at that time. And so for someone to say, hey, maybe all of the species are not static, but they've actually evolved over a period of time, according to Denton, seemed like a very, very popular item to catch on. So I don't know any more about than why it happened and how it got to that place, other than to say it did. And that's well documented, that it went from something that was highly controversial in 20 years to something that scientists were saying, it's a fact. And now the problem with that is what we're going to see tonight. Turn the page. When we get into the first discussion of one of these tenets, what we're going to see, I think, sometimes is what I'm going to illustrate with this book right here. Now, this is a children's book, okay? You can see. It's called The Wonderful Egg, all right? It was written quite some time ago by an evolutionist, all right? And it basically just says, long, long ago, there were, over 100 million years ago, everything was different than it was today. It was so long ago that there were no cities or houses, And it says, back in those long ago days, the only big animals that trampled around were the dinosaurs, And then it says, and one wonderful egg sat all alone in a blue-green area. And then it goes on to say, I wonder what kind of egg it is. Since there were so many dinosaurs, don't you think it was a dinosaur egg? And then it says, I wonder if it's, a stegosaurus. A triceratops. I don't know my dinosaurs. I wonder if it's a triceratops egg. And, I wonder if it's a stegosaurus egg. And it goes on and on and on and on. What's very interesting about the end of it, the end of it is that when you get to the very time when the egg hatches, it doesn't come out a dinosaur at all. It was a dinosaur egg. It comes out a bird, a very beautiful bird with all of these feathers on it. And it says, and when it hatched into a baby bird, the first baby bird in the whole world. And the baby bird grew up to be a beautiful bird with feathers, the first beautiful bird that ever sang a song high in the treetops of the new green world of long, long ago. Now, you might excuse this, saying, well, this is just a very cute way of teaching young children evolutionary thought. My question to you is, would you think it was a cute way to do it in high school? And so I'm going to be bringing to you tonight some evolutionary tenets that scientists know are faulty, that are still being used in their textbooks, because according to them, it's a good way of illustrating the fact of evolution. Take a look at what we're this first great tenet of evolution called homology. Homology is defined now differently than it was defined before. It was defined before with the idea that it's just similar structures. In other words, it's similar because when we take apart the flesh off of the bones, etc., they look similar. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking at that right now, and they absolutely look similar to me. I'm not going to deny for one moment that the human hand and the harbor seal flipper and the gray whale flipper look dissimilar. They look quite similar to me. Okay? What Darwin said, though, is those similar structures that he noticed in nature, he stated, were evidence of common descent. Evidence of one early ancestor that was exactly the beginning, the prototype for everything. Now, many scientists of the day believed that these were from common ancestry, and I don't mean all the way back to the beginning of one ancestor. I mean, they believe that they had a common archetype somehow. But some of those scientists actually believe that the common archetype was by plan of God, the same God that we believe in. So it is quite interesting that now the word homology has a different meaning among scientists. And so you have a definition here which basically says common homology is the existence of shared ancestry between a pair of structures or genes in different species. Well, that's not what it used to mean. It just meant shared similarity of structure, or what we call morphology. And morphology has also been redefined. Morphology was simply defined before as just the outward structure or the appearance of a particular organism. That's all it was. But now, look at the definition. The size, shape, and structure of an organism or one of its parts. Biologists usually describe morphology of an organism separately from its physiology. In other words, how the parts actually work together. In traditional systems of taxonomy, classifications were based upon the morphological characteristics of organisms. However, now they've changed that, okay? And you run the risk, it says, of grouping together organisms that are actually relatively unrelated but have evolved similar features. Okay, so what Darwin was saying in the beginning is that morphology or the outward structure, that the homology of an animal that shared similar structures had to come from one common ancestor. This was evidence of it. In more modern systems of taxonomy, the genetic similarity of organisms studied through the methods of molecular biology is considered in addition to morphology and establishing the taxa. Okay, so what they're now saying is the synthesis of Darwinian evolution and neo-Darwinian evolution, taking the natural selection along with the homology that he said, these shared similar features, and joining that with what we know about gene theory today, or gene science today, has to come together in order to share the common ancestor, whether it's near that ancestor or all the way back to the beginning. Now, I'm going to make a point here. Maybe you're going, whoa, what did you just say? Okay, the point is this. How can you determine today, what is the threshold today for the number of genes that one has to have that is shared among those species in order to say or to determine its common ancestry? You're going to have a problem doing that. And that's what scientists argue about quite a bit. Oh, this structure looks exactly like that structure. In other words, my eyeball looks very much like an octopus eye. Very much. But no biologist says that we have an early common ancestor. No, they're not going to say that. So just because they're similar doesn't indicate to biologists or evolutionists anymore that there is a common ancestor not too far back in the history of that species. The problem occurs with, again, how do you determine what is shared ancestry, and how are you going to determine whether there is a common ancestor? So look at what Jonathan Wells says here. Okay, and I'm just going to read this out of his book called Icons of Evolution, page 61. So he just simply says this, and here are my glasses. Darwin considered homology important evidence for evolution, listing it among the facts which, quote, proclaim so plainly that the innumerable species, genera, and families with which this world is peopled are all descended, each within its own class or group, from common parents. The link between homology and common descent was so central to Darwin's theory that his followers actually redefined homology to mean features inherited from a common ancestor. Even after homology was redefined, however, the Darwinian account remained incomplete without a mechanism to explain why homologous features were so similar in such different organisms. When neo-Darwinism arose in the 1930s and 40s, it seemed to have a solution to this problem. Homologous features were attributed to similar genes inherited from a common ancestor. And you would think that that would be the case, but ladies and gentlemen, in other words, according to homology, the same genes should form the same structures in animals, but they do not. So there's problems with all of this. In fact, there's even problems with some biologists and some philosophers, as I put down here, with the circular reasoning. As Wells says, if homology is now defined as similarity due to a common descent, then it is circular reasoning to use it as evidence of common descent. What are you going to say in this whole idea of homology? Are you going to look at things and say, well, because they look similar, that they had to have a common ancestor? I'm going to ask you a question. Does that necessarily follow? Does the Ford look similar to the GM product? Why, of course it does. Did it have a common ancestor? No. They just had designers that recognized that certain wheelbases and axles worked on every car that they would want to do and make. And so therefore, it doesn't mean that they were all made out of the same factory. They were not. They're made out of different factories because the designers decided that that was a good design to utilize. Does a gene from a bat, because it's similar to my genes in my body, does that necessarily imply that there is a common ancestor? Or might it also imply that the common traits and the common genes demand the same designer, who decided that the whale's flipper would work just fine with a similar type of morphology that's used in my hand. And in fact, I flip in the ocean and in the pool in much the same way. And so my hands do a very good job of that, and for other swimmers as well. So what we're going to look at now is this 5-minute video on homology.
According to critics of Darwin's theory, finch beaks, four-winged fruit flies, and drug-resistant bacteria all raise problems for the neo-Darwinian claim that random mutations and natural selection drive the development of life. But there's another part of Darwin's theory that is also being challenged by some scientists. That's the claim that all living things are ultimately descended from a common ancestor. This claim underlies perhaps the biggest icon of evolution of all, the tree of life.
The classical Darwinian picture of the history of life is that of a tree, that these small incremental changes build up and they branch out, and so you start from very simple life and eventually you get everything that we have around us, from elephants to alligators to chimpanzees and everything in between.
Critics say that evidence used to support Darwin's tree of life is just as questionable as evidence used for the other icons of evolution. One major piece of evidence used to support the tree of life is homology.
There is the front flipper, a hand built on the same model as my own hand.
Biologists define homology as similarity in structure between different organisms.
Now this has the same design exactly as your arm. There's the upper
My
arm,
textbook
one bone.
would show the forelimb, a hand, and it would show a bat's wing and a whale's flipper, and say because they have similar structure, have similar bone pattern, that they must share a common ancestor.
And then the 5 very long fingers. just like yours.
The mere pattern of the bones doesn't tell you how it happened. You have to supply a mechanism to explain how it got that way. Well, Darwin's mechanism, as understood by modern Darwinists, was genetic. You inherited similar genes, and these genes made the bones grow the way they do. The problem is that the evidence doesn't fit that explanation.
According to modern Darwinism, if two structures are similar because of common ancestry, each structure should be produced by similar genes and go through a similar pattern of development in the embryo. But contrary to these predictions, biologists are learning that homologous structures can be produced by different genes and follow different patterns of development. For example, biologists consider the body segments of fruit flies and wasps as homologous. Darwinism predicts that these similarities should be due to the same gene. But in fact, different genes account for the development of body segments in these insects. This contradicts the idea that homology must point to common ancestry. In the same way, many body structures considered homologous by biologists develop in embryos in fundamentally different ways. One example is the gut in vertebrates.
If the Darwinian theory were correct, the process by which the gut is constructed should itself be homologous. In fact, this isn't the case. We know, for instance, that in different vertebrates, the gut is constructed in very different ways during development.
In sharks, the gut develops from cells in the roof of the embryonic cavity. In lampreys, the gut develops from cells on the floor of the embryonic cavity. And in frogs, the gut develops from cells in both the roof and the floor.
So you have a homologous structure in vertebrates that is built in one way in a shark, in one way in a lamprey, in another way in frogs, and you've got these very different developmental pathways converging to the same structure. This is very hard to reconcile with Darwinian common descent.
These marine reptiles were built on much the same plan as you are.
I would say in the past 20 years of studying this problem that biology is now entering what can only be described as a revolution, because the evidence is so overwhelmingly against the conventional neo-Darwinian view.
Now, what about those other reptiles that flew in the air?
Are there any questions about this idea of homology at this point that I can help clear up? You understand that it is a major tenet of Darwinian evolution, and it is used quite often in textbooks. The very illustration that I give you there is going to be found in textbooks. And that basically is going to bring students, early on students, who have already been told that evolution is a fact, if they see the similarities, then they basically are told from common descent. But what we're finding out about the genetics today simply doesn't support that. And there is no mechanism that they can come up with in evolutionary thought to explain how these things happen. Another one of those illustrations, this one profoundly affected me. I did not take biology in high school. I took chemistry, but I remember seeing this in high school somewhere. I remember hearing a lot about evolution in high school in the 60s when I was there, and I remember seeing this, Haeckel's embryos. And to me, this was a powerful reason for why someone might believe in evolution. I mean, look at all of that top level there. All of those embryos look so much alike. You will find these drawings, Haeckel's drawings, in textbooks today. And you might see them there today, and with few exceptions, most of them don't say anything about the fact that they've been fudged, that they were doctored by Haeckel in the beginning, that he actually messed around with them and indicated that the beginning of their embryonic stages is what he was showing here, and it's not. This is actually a mid-stage for most of these drawings. And the idea is if you have common descent, then those embryos should look very, very similar at the beginning stages, which they do not. This is another thing that this science teacher got in trouble for.
One article Roger DeHart wanted to show students was from the American Biology Teacher, the leading peer-reviewed journal for secondary school biology teachers. It was written by Jonathan Wells, a biologist with a PhD in molecular and cell biology from the University of California at Berkeley. Wells is one of a growing number of scientists raising objections to Darwin's theory. In his article, Wells points out how many textbooks continue to use fraudulent drawings of embryos made by 19th century German Darwinist Ernst Haeckel.
Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist and artist, a contemporary of Darwin's, who, among other things, made some famous drawings of vertebrate embryos, fish, humans, salamanders, chicks, turtles, and so on. And in those drawings, Haeckel tried to show that all these different vertebrates look very much the same as early embryos. Their early similarities showed that they came from a common ancestor, and differences arose only later. The problem is that he faked his drawings. The early vertebrate embryos don't really look that similar at all.
The problem with Haeckel's drawings wasn't just that they were inaccurate, they were actually false in many cases. But the real damage was done when these drawings entered into biology textbooks decades ago, and they've never really been taken out. If you open a high school biology text now, or even a college biology text, you'll find these drawings, although they may not refer to them as Haeckel's drawings, and in fact, they trace their ancestry directly to Haeckel.
You see the pictures of the embryos.
And it's really damaged our understanding of development and our understanding of biology in general.
It's clear that Haeckel may have fudged his drawings somewhat to look more like his ideal than they actually are. Now, does that actually take away from what we know about the relationship of embryology to evolution? Not a bit. The whole Haeckel's embryo story has been greatly blown out of significance. It is a minor footnote in the history of science, and actually it's been known for 10 or 15 years that Haeckel's embryos are not to be relied upon. The reason why the diagrams are reproduced is because they're easily available. There's no copyright on them. It's an easy way to illustrate a point. And I would argue that the basic point that's being illustrated by those drawings is still accurate.
But if you go back earlier in development, the different classes of vertebrates look even more different.
According to Wells, Haeckel, in many modern textbooks, misleads students not just because of fake drawings, but because they leave out the earliest stages of embryonic development. What students are shown as the first stage of embryonic development is actually the mid-stage.
And very few textbooks show those earliest stages, and yet that's the whole point. It's the earliest stages that are supposed to be the most similar, and they're not. Some textbooks actually use photographs of embryos, but they pick only that stage and those classes that happen to look most similar. And they omit the earlier stages, and they omit those classes that don't look similar. So that, to me, is picking the evidence very carefully to support the theory, and that's not good science.
Wells is a critic of Darwin's theory, but even staunch evolutionists like Harvard's Stephen Jay Gould have criticized the use of diagrams based on Haeckel in textbooks.
Stephen Jay Gould wrote an article for Natural History saying that we need to let go of these drawings, that basically that they're not needed.
But when DeHart requested permission to let students read Gould's article, that request was turned down too.
Why does Mr. DeHart feel so strongly to have these articles read? Well, it's because he wants to call into question the whole issue of whether evolution happened. I don't think this is good science education for the students in that district, and apparently neither did his colleagues nor his superintendent.
We have a science curriculum. We have a mainstream science theory called evolution. Our job is to teach the adopted curriculum, and that's what we follow.
But just how important are Haeckel's embryos? And does a single textbook mistake even matter?
If Haeckel's embryo drawings were the only problem with biology textbooks, I would agree that this is an isolated error. The problem is that it's not the only problem.
In fact, says Wells, today's textbooks are filled with outdated examples for evolution, which many evolutionary biologists no longer consider good science. In a recent book, he calls these the icons of evolution.
The icons of evolution, these are examples of textbook evidences that have taken on a life of their own. They go far beyond the truth, far beyond the facts, and have become symbols, in effect, of Darwin's theory, symbols that actually distort the scientific evidence. In many cases, they're called icons by Darwinian biologists themselves.
So I would just have to disagree with the whole sense that this is okay to use in science textbooks today because the end justifies the mean. That if that's the way you're going to reason in science, if you're going to look at a high school student and say, you can't really come to a conclusion about the information on evolution based upon the drawings that we would give you now, which would be correct, then what we have to do is go back and use these iconic drawings. So you're going to see, how many times do you see the ape, getting bigger and bigger and then standing upright and then going all the way? Is that not one of the icons of evolution? And yet, has anybody ever been able to prove that that's how that's happened? No. Just like they haven't proven that embryonic stages in the earliest are similar, because they are not. And any other scientist that would do that on purpose in order to get a scientific thought across to other scientists or to those who were budding scientists, I find that hard to stomach. And yet, these are the things that are being used as some of the great tenets of evolution. Jenny, did you have a question? Well, you can, the only recourse that you have is to talk to the Board of Education, and the only recourse that the Board of Education can have in this case is to say, we will abide by recent legislation in Congress that says that it is all right for a science teacher to bring in other articles by reputable scientists that question certain processes or icons of evolution. That's about all I think you can do at this time. And the teacher would have to have, but also you have to understand that if a teacher goes out on that limb, that there's already been precedents for that person being taken out of the classroom. They weren't fired. They were taken out of the classroom and put, in administration type of things where they could no longer, indoctrinate those youth anymore like Socrates did by questioning things. So he basically had to drink the poison and go away. I think that that's more advocacy than science, and I have a problem with that. The second thing that we're going to be looking at tonight, in a total of 5 minutes, is this idea of gradualism. Look at what Charles Darwin says on his own with regard to gradualism. It is, first of all, a tenet in evolutionary theory maintaining that species evolve slowly and continuously over long periods of geological time. Even though scientists now will say there are certain explosions of animals that occur in the fossil record, so not everything is with successive slight modification. Notice what Darwin says, though. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. First thing I want to say is, can I question that? Am I allowed to question that in a biology classroom? Oh, you're saying yes. I think not. If you go back and read what is stated here on page 18, I don't think I can question that. Now, I'm saying I would hope that students would question the same thing. They would say, okay, Darwin said this, I am going to question whether or not the eye itself could come about by numerous, successive, slight modifications. I'm going to question that. Well, that's the same thing that this man questioned here. Michael Behe questions whether or not those things can come about by numerous, slight modifications in succession, and he basically is the one who has come up with the idea of irreducible complexity, something that Neil brought up in one of his Lord's Supper talks not too long ago. So this whole idea here that Darwin stated himself, I believe, is something that ought to be questioned if he questioned it himself. Now, how in the world has science come to the point where Darwin could say this in the 1850s or 60s or 70s, and we've gotten to the point where we no longer even want to look at that as a possibility? In fact, we've gone the other way. Because what did Darwin believe about the earliest organisms of life that they would have to be? That the more and more that we looked at the earliest forms of life, especially in the fossil record, we would see what? We would see simple forms, wouldn't we? We could not see things that were complicated. We could not see things that were complex. And yet, the fossil record doesn't show that. We'll be looking at that next week, a lot about the fossil record and the Cambrian explosion. And it doesn't even follow when you look at the cell. Now that we have electron microscopes, and you can look into the cell, and you can look into the nucleus, and you can look into what those cells have to do in order to reproduce themselves, the scientist is absolutely, it's a beautiful, awe-inspiring thing to know how complex one cell of our body is, and that it has the DNA instructions in it, and the RNA that can replicate the DNA instructions, and then by RNA trucks or transports take it out to a certain place, and then rebuild my bones, and actually know, which they don't know how, that those bone cells will go to the middle of my bone to replace them there, some of them, and others of them will go to the end and round it off. And so when you start looking at this idea of irreducible complexity and you start looking at the cell, you're seeing something that Darwin never, ever got to see, that he could not contemplate at that time. And one of the best illustrations of irreducible complexity, is not that one, is the one that you have in your booklet on page 20. It's just the mouse trap. If you take anything off the mouse trap, it's not going to work. In fact, the other day, I got out an old rat trap because rats were getting into my garden again and eating my tomatoes, and I thought, they're going down, So I get this old rat trap, and it's just slightly bent in one part. Let me tell you, do you know what happened? My finger got mashed so hard in that rat trap. There is no way that rat trap's going to work. Okay? So here's this whole idea of what Behe states. By irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of those parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Now, the easy description is the mouse or rat trap. Here's the one that just will blow your mind. There is the diagram of the bacterial flagellum that is part of every cellular structure that we have in organisms, and it is amazing. I will not bore you with the page after page of what Behe goes through to explain how that process works. But that looks like something that man would invent, wouldn't it? Because it looks like an outboard motor. But what's interesting is that God's design in the cell was replicated by somebody doing a motor, because that little flagellum spins around again and again and again and operates that particular cellular structure, which if it does not, you don't reproduce cells, and if you don't reproduce cells, you die. And every one of those parts there is absolutely necessary. When I read this book, and I'm not suggesting that you read this book necessarily over other books for the first time, but when I read this book, Michael Behe went through a 16-page biochemical discussion of how blood clotting took place. I did not understand it, but I read every word of it, and at the end of it, I was getting one of those, I have got to hit my knees and say, God, how wonderfully I am made, just like David. And that every part of that blood clotting, which is one system in the body, if any part of it is not there, it does not work. And we bleed to death when we nick ourselves shaving. It's an amazing thing. How can the evolutionist then say that this process came about? There are abstracts and papers being written by molecular biologists all the time on this. None, absolutely none, according to Behe, ever are written on how the process came about. None of them. They're all written on what we have observed through microscopes and what they do. That to me is very telling. And so I think one of the questions that I have to ask is, well, or this statement, if you assume evolution to be true, it makes sense to state, quote, we don't know how these irreducibly complex systems came about, we just know they did. That is, to an evolutionist, that makes sense. But to a critic of evolution, why would that make sense? If you've already believed in it in the beginning, then you will just accept, I can't explain that, but I know it did come about by slight, successive, gradual, evolving processes over long periods of time. That every once in a while, hatched from a dinosaur egg, a bird with a bunch of feathers that sang a song for the first time ever on the face of the earth. Okay, so those are two tenets or icons of evolution that I would like to bring to you and have you think about those things. Because again, if the only debate in evolution is the processes, then why can't I debate that process and turn around and say, I call in question whether or not it happened, because you cannot explain this process by an evolutionary thought. And Darwin stated himself that if he couldn't, that if it's going to be called into question that way, that his theory would absolutely break down. Your thoughts? Yes, Kurt.
My thoughts on why an evolutionists think the way they do is because of their fundamental philosophical beliefs.
It's a worldview, isn't it? Yeah.
And so that's the bottom line. And as amazing as it seems, there was a scientist who actually did propose that the first bird hatched out of a dinosaur egg. In the 40s, Ernst Goldsmith came up with this whole philosophy. And he was so ridiculed by his colleagues that they dropped it. But because even Jay Gould can see that gradual failure, he's adjusted Goldsmith's theory and brought it back up with punctuated evolution. So they will think that the most ridiculous idea
Well, and I'm not here to state that about all scientists or some scientists. Okay. What I am just here to state is, where does the evidence lead you? And I believe that the evidence leads me to question whether or not it actually took place. I don't think I could make evolution guilty of being in existence so far, from my understanding of what the beginning principles of this are and the ending principles of this are at this particular time. It does not occur to me that this is scientific. And that's what I'm trying to, hopefully am helping you understand in this way. Now, I want you also to know, just like last week, for everything that I brought up, an evolutionist will have some sort of answer for it. Don't believe that they won't. Okay, but there are some things that they don't have an answer for, and they will just simply say, you're right. I cannot explain how that came about through gradualism, or how it came about through genetic mutations, or any of the fundamental tenets of evolution, but it doesn't mean that it didn't. We just haven't found out how it did. And that's why we continue to search in science. Well, if that's the case, then why is evolution called a fact still, and no one is really allowed, in the sense, to challenge it in the school system of today?